The Volvo's engine ticked as it cooled, a metallic metronome in the silence of the deep woods. Sarah stood ankle-deep in mud, the rain plastering her hair to her forehead, staring at the rough-hewn timber of the cabin. It was ugly, it was isolated, and it was the undeniable physical proof that her father, the esteemed Dr. Robert Vance, was a liar. She gripped the brass key so tightly its jagged teeth bit into her palm. Most people would have felt grief standing there. Sarah felt a cold, grim vindication. There is a specific kind of bitterness that settles in when you realize your cynicism was right all along. She had spent 40 years trying to earn the affection of a man who seemed perpetually distracted, always looking just over her shoulder at something more important. Now, she believed she knew what that something was. She didn't just find a cabin. She found the place where his money and his attention had gone for 3 decades. 36 hours earlier, the house had been filled with the suffocating scent of lilies and the hushed, polite murmuring of the town's elite. Robert Vance had been a pillar of the community, a surgeon who saved lives with steady hands and a stoic demeanor. He was a saint, a neighbor had told Sarah, squeezing her hand too hard. He was a stranger, Sarah had thought, though she nodded politely. After the guests left and her mother, fragile and medicated, had finally fallen asleep, Sarah went to his study. She told herself she was looking for insurance papers. In reality, she was looking for him, or rather, an explanation for him. She began clearing the desk with the ruthless efficiency of a woman who uses organization as a shield against emotion. She sorted bills, shredded junk mail, and boxed up medical journals. It was when she pulled the bottom drawer all the way out, something her father, a private man, would never have done in front of her, that she saw it. A heavy envelope taped to the underside of the wood. Inside wasn't a will. It was a deed to a property in Blackwood, 2 hours north, and a single brass key. No note, no explanation, just a location and the means to access it. A man doesn't hide a piece of property unless he's hiding what happens inside it. Nobestidi, stay with us. Subscribe to the channel, like this video if this story is already making you reflect. And let us know in the comments where you're listening from. Your presence is what brings these stories to life. Sarah didn't tell her mother. Why ruin the illusion? Her mother had spent 50 years being the dutiful wife to the great man. Let her keep her grief pure. Sarah, however, needed the truth. She drove north with the radio off. The silence gave her mind ample room to construct the narrative. It's a human survival mechanism. When faced with a void, we fill it with monsters we recognize. Sarah's monster was simple. Another woman. It explained everything. The late nights at the hospital, the weekends spent at conferences where he couldn't be reached, the tension in the house when the bank statements arrived. Sarah remembered a fight from her teenage years. Her mother crying over a cancelled vacation, her father standing by the window, his back turned, saying, "The money is tied up, Martha. It's necessary." Necessary, Sarah whispered to the wet windshield, steering around a pothole. Is that what you called her? She felt a surge of adrenaline, but beneath it lay a profound exhaustion. She was 52 years old, a vice principal at a high school, a woman who played by the rules. She was tired of being the responsible one in a family of secrets. She wanted to confront the mess he left behind, scream at the walls, and then sell the place to pay back the emotional debt he owed them. The GPS had led her down an unmarked gravel road that felt less like a thoroughfare and more like a warning. The woods here were dense, the kind of old-growth forest that swallows sound. And now, standing before the door, the key in her hand felt heavy. The cabin wasn't the romantic getaway she had envisioned. There were no flower boxes, no porch swing for lovers to watch the sunset. The windows were small and barred with iron. The perimeter was cleared of brush, purely functional. It looked less like a love nest and more like a fortress. But denial is a stubborn architect. It builds structures that reality has a hard time knocking down. He probably kept it rustic to avoid suspicion, Sarah reasoned. She marched up the steps, the wood groaning under her boots. She didn't knock. You don't knock on a door you own by right of inheritance. She jammed the key into the lock. It was stiff, unused to new hands, but it turned with a heavy thunk. Sarah pushed the door open and stepped out of the rain, shaking her umbrella. She expected the smell of stale perfume, or perhaps dust. Instead, she was hit with the sterile, sharp scent of antiseptic and bleach. The main room was dim, lit only by the grey daylight filtering through the blinds. But it wasn't empty. "Don't move," a voice rasped. Sarah froze. Emerging from the shadows of a hallway was a man. He was older, perhaps 70, wearing a flannel shirt worn thin at the elbows and holding a heavy iron poker from the fireplace. He didn't look like a squatter. He looked like a sentry who had been at his post for a very long time. He wasn't the mistress Sarah expected. He was something far more confusing. "Who are you?" Sarah demanded, her voice shaking but authoritative, the voice she used on rebellious students. "I am Robert Vance's daughter. I own this place." The old man lowered the poker slowly, his eyes narrowing as he scanned her face. He didn't look frightened. He looked deeply, profoundly sad. "You have his eyes," the man said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. "He said you might come, though he hoped you never would." Sarah stepped forward, her anger flaring again to cover her fear. "Where is he, or she? Who are you keeping here?" The man leaned the poker against the wall. He looked tired, a bone-deep fatigue that comes from carrying a burden that isn't yours. "I'm John," he said, "and you have the wrong idea, Miss Vance. This isn't a place for secrets you run to. It's a place for secrets you run from." He gestured toward a heavy, reinforced door at the back of the cabin. It had a sliding bolt on the outside. "If you want to know who drained your father's life," John said softly, "he's in there." The bolt on the door didn't slide easily. It required force, the kind of heavy metallic shove that suggests whatever is on the other side isn't meant to be part of the polite world. John's hands were steady, though. They were hands that had done this motion 1,000 times, a ritual of containment. Sarah stood a few feet back, her breath hitching in her throat. Her anger, previously a roaring fire, was flickering now, dampened by a creeping cold dread. "We often claim we want the truth, but what we really want is confirmation." Sarah wanted to find a silk robe, a bottle of wine, a second family living in luxury. That was a betrayal she knew how to process. It was a cliché. She could hate a cliché. But the smell drifting from the cracks of the heavy door wasn't perfume. It was the smell of a nursing home, rubbing alcohol, damp cotton, and the unmistakable stale scent of confined air. "Prepare yourself," John murmured, not looking back. "He's having a bad day." He pushed the door open. Sarah stepped into the room, and the narrative she had constructed of her father's secret life shattered instantly. The room was not a bedroom. It was a makeshift intensive care unit. The windows were blacked out with heavy curtains. In the corner, a heart monitor from the late 90s hummed rhythmically, its green line tracing a slow, fragile existence. Shelves lined the walls, not filled with books or trinkets, but with boxes of gauze, feeding tubes, and sterile saline. And in the center of the room, in a hospital bed that looked far too large for him, lay a man. He was skeletal, his skin the pallor of someone who hasn't seen the sun in years. His dark hair was brushed neatly, though, and his face was shaved. He was asleep, or perhaps just somewhere else, his chest rising and falling with a shallow, mechanical rhythm. Sarah's purse slipped from her shoulder, hitting the floor with a thud. The noise didn't wake him. "Who is this?" Sarah whispered. Her voice lacked all its former authority. It was the voice of a child waking up in a strange house. John walked to the bedside, his movements tender. He adjusted the blanket, pulling it up to the man's chin with a gentleness that contrasted with his rough appearance. "This is Michael," John said. He looked at Sarah, his eyes hard. "Your brother." Sarah felt the room spin. "I don't have a brother. I'm an only child. My mother—" "Your mother doesn't know," John cut in. "No one knows, just me, and the doctor." Sarah walked closer, compelled by a morbid gravity. She looked at Michael's face. It was distorted by illness, yes, but the architecture was undeniable. He had the same sharp nose as her father, the same brow, but where her father's face had been hardened by ambition, this face was blank, a canvas erased by suffering. "He's 48, John said quietly. "Though he has the mind of a child. He's been in this room since he was 20. But thank you for staying with us so far." Stories like this aren't easy to hear, but they're necessary to understand what comes next. If this is resonating with you, consider subscribing and sharing it with someone who might need it. Sarah reached out, her hand hovering over Michael's arm, but she didn't touch him. She was struck by a sudden, violent realization of the logistics involved, the money, the conferences, the emotional distance. "Why?" Sarah asked, her voice trembling. "Why hide him? If he's sick, why not a hospital? Why this prison?" John sighed, a sound that seemed to rattle in his chest. He walked over to a small desk in the corner of the room, a replica of the desk Sarah had cleared out the day before. On it sat a stack of leather-bound journals. "Because shame is a more powerful motivator than love, Miss Vance," John said, "and fear is stronger than both." He picked up the top journal and held it out to her. "Your father didn't hide Michael because he was ashamed of him," John corrected her, his voice taking on a sharp edge. "He hid Michael because he was ashamed of himself." Sarah took the book. It was heavy. She opened it to a random page. The handwriting was her father's, cramped, precise, the script of a surgeon, but the words weren't medical notes, they were confessions. September 14th, 1998. "The fever is down, but the neurological deficits are permanent. I see it in his eyes. He doesn't recognize me today. I did this. God help me, I was so sure of the dosage. I was so arrogant. I have destroyed my own son." Sarah looked up, the words blurring. He treated him?" "He was the only one who treated him," John said. "Michael wasn't born like this, Sarah. He was a bright kid, a little wild maybe, a secret from a relationship before he met your mother. But when Michael got sick, your father insisted on treating him himself, privately, to keep it quiet." John looked at the sleeping man. "The doctor made a mistake, a calculation error. 1 decimal point. It caused a stroke that wiped the slate clean." Sarah stared at the man in the bed. The monster she had come to kill wasn't a mistress. It was her father's ego. And the victim wasn't her mother. It was this man, trapped in a twilight existence, kept alive by the very man who had ended his life. "He bought this land," John continued, relentless. "He hired me. I was an orderly at the hospital then. He knew I needed the money. He built this place not to hide a sin, but to serve a sentence. He came here every weekend not to play, but to work, to change catheters, to prevent bed sores, to look his mistake in the eye." Sarah looked around the room again. It wasn't a fortress, it was a penance. She looked at the equipment. It was old, but meticulously maintained. The sheer cost of this, the electricity, the medical supplies, John's salary, must have been astronomical. "The bank accounts," Sarah whispered. "The loans." "Every cent," John confirmed. "He died with almost nothing in his personal accounts, didn't he? He kept the big house for your mother, kept up appearances, but everything else, it went into keeping Michael alive." Sarah felt a wave of nausea. She had judged her father for being cold, for being distant. She hadn't realized that his coldness was a necessity. He was a man carrying a burning coal in his bare hands, trying not to let the smoke show. She looked at the journal again. The entries went on for years, decades of detailed observations, not just medical data, but small, heartbreaking notes. Christmas Eve, 2005. I brought him a radio. He seemed to like the jazz station. I sat with him for 4 hours. I told him about Sarah's graduation. He didn't understand, but he squeezed my hand. I don't deserve that squeeze. Sarah closed the book. The leather felt cold. He wanted to protect your mother, John said, moving to check the IV drip. He knew if she found out about the boy and about what he did to the boy, it would kill her, or she would hate him. He couldn't bear either. So he let me hate him instead, Sarah said. It wasn't a question. It was a realization. John stopped and looked at her. He figured you were strong enough to handle his silence. He didn't think Michael was strong enough to handle the world. Suddenly the machine beeped, a faster rhythm. Michael shifted in the bed, his eyes fluttering open. They were milky, unfocused, darting around the room until they landed blindly in Sarah's direction. He made a sound, a low, guttural moan that sounded painfully like a word trying to escape a broken throat. Da! Sarah froze. The air in the room seemed to vanish. John stepped back, giving her space. He thinks you're him. You have the same presence. Sarah stood at the precipice of a choice. She could turn around, walk out, sell the land, and pretend this shadow life never existed. It was what a rational person would do. It was what the Sarah of yesterday would have done. But she wasn't the Sarah of yesterday anymore. She was the daughter of a man who had been crushed by his own humanity. She walked to the side of the bed. She looked down at the brother she never knew, the living wreckage of her father's pride. Michael's hand twitched on the sheet. Sarah slowly, terrifyingly, reached out and took it. The hand in hers was dry and papery, the skin spanning bones that felt too fragile for a grown man. Michael didn't let go. His grip was surprisingly strong, a desperate, reflexive clutch of a drowning swimmer finding a raft. Sarah didn't pull away. In that sterile room, surrounded by the hum of machinery and the smell of rubbing alcohol, the anger that had fueled her for days evaporated. It didn't disappear. It simply transmuted into something heavier, understanding. We often believe that forgiveness is a moment of release, a sudden unburdening. But for Sarah, forgiveness wasn't a letting go. It was a picking up. She was picking up the weight her father had finally set down. "He waited for you, you know," John said, his voice breaking the rhythmic silence of the monitor. "The doctor. Towards the end, when the cancer got bad, he worried less about dying and more about this. About who would change the sheets, who would pay the electric bill, who would remember that Michael likes the blinds open at 4 p.m. to feel the sun." Sarah looked at John. The old caretaker was watching her with a mixture of defiance and resignation, expecting the inevitable. He expected the buyout check. He expected the facility transfer forms. "My mother," Sarah started, her voice steady now. "She can never know about this." John nodded slowly. That was his rule too. "Not because of his reputation," Sarah corrected, looking back at Michael's sleeping face, "but because it would kill her. She's too frail to carry the truth that her hero was the villain in his own son's life." She squeezed Michael's hand back, a silent pact. "I have money," Sarah said, the practical vice principal taking the wheel. "My father left me a separate life insurance policy. I never understood why he split it from Mom's. Now I do." John's eyes widened slightly. "Miss Vance? I'll be here on Saturdays," she said, turning to face him. "You can't do this alone forever, John. You need help, and I need to know him." She wasn't doing it out of guilt. She was doing it because she finally understood the equation her father had lived by. Love isn't just about presence. Sometimes love is about containment. The drive back south was different. The rain had stopped, leaving the world scrubbed clean and grey. Sarah didn't listen to the radio. She practiced the lies she would tell. When she walked into her parents' house, her mother's house now, the air was warm and smelled of lavender and denial. Her mother was sitting in the sunroom, looking through old photo albums. "Sarah," her mother said, smiling weakly, "I was just looking at pictures of your father. He always looked so serious, didn't he? Even on vacation." Sarah sat down beside her. She looked at the photo. Robert Vance stood on a beach, looking away from the camera, his jaw set, looking north, looking toward the cabin. "He was a serious man, Mom," Sarah said softly. "He was perfect." Her mother sighed, closing the album. "I don't know how I'll live without him. He took care of everything." A younger Sarah would have snapped. She would have thrown the truth on the table like a grenade, desperate to shatter her mother's naive idolization. She would have screamed, "He wasn't perfect. He maimed a child. He lied to us every single day." But Sarah didn't speak. She looked at her mother's trembling hands, the thin skin, the fearful eyes of a woman who had been sheltered from the storm for 50 years. Sarah realized then that the shelter wasn't free. Her father had paid for it with his soul. "Yes, Mom," Sarah lied, her voice smooth and kind. "He took care of everything, and now I will." 2 weeks later, Sarah visited the cemetery. It was a crisp Tuesday morning. The grass was manicured, the headstone polished granite. Dr. Robert Vance, beloved husband and father, healer of many. Sarah stood over the grave. She didn't bring flowers. She brought a small, portable radio, the one from the cabin that had broken. She placed it on the grass. "I fixed it," she told the stone. "It was just a loose wire. He's listening to the jazz station again." The wind rustled the trees. "I was so angry at you," she whispered. "I thought you didn't love me because you were never there. I didn't know you were busy keeping the sky from falling." She touched the cold granite. It was the closest she would ever get to a hug from him. "You can rest now, Dad," she said, the title feeling earned for the first time in years. "I've got the watch." She turned and walked back to her car. She had a long drive ahead of her. There was a leak in the cabin roof that needed fixing, and Michael needed new socks. Sarah Vance had gone looking for a scandal. Instead, she found her inheritance. It wasn't money and it wasn't a house. It was a secret, and for the first time in her life, she felt strong enough to carry it. We live in an era that demands total transparency, where every secret is treated as a betrayal and every silence as a lie. But the story of Robert and Sarah Vance challenges that modern reflex. It reminds us that adulthood is often the transition from judging our parents to understanding them. Dr. Vance's heroism wasn't in his surgical skill, but in his capacity to endure the isolation of his own guilt so his family wouldn't have to. Sometimes the greatest act of love isn't what we share with others, but what we spare them from. Sarah didn't just inherit a brother, she inherited the maturity to understand that peace is a luxury purchased by those willing to carry the war inside them. And Dame, this is... Sinead, thank you for spending this time with us. If this story stayed with you, don't forget to like and subscribe. You're invited to continue this journey with our other stories now appearing on your screen.